who's watching him.
So you can
Do you need some water?
person and you can put it and then you can put a location or like what we would do when we had people watching the kids. Child care and then in that parentheses in the address part we would put the person's name. That's their name. And then this is the one I do.
And some
It's
other
like
people have.
a shopping list. So
Okay.
you can go into
point during the discussion, you can raise it up and someone will come around and collect it. There's also a microphone for questions, or you could also come up here to the podium and ask questions as well. So without further ado, let's have the panelists introduce themselves and give everyone a little bit of background about who you are.
I'm Ken Plaga. I'm the Chief of Police here from Meridian Township. Just got the job in July, so I've been with the township for 23 years.
I'm Bree Randall Gay. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse.
Hi, my name is Francie Hakes. I was a state and federal prosecutor for 16 years, focusing on child sexual abuse at the state and the federal level. And I was the congressionally mandated DOJ appointee to handle the country and the world's first national strategy to fight child exploitation, which we put to Congress in 2010. And I'd love to talk about that a little bit today, a little bit later. I am now a consultant and expert witness. I consult with Jim at a production company in LA, trying to put out true crime entertainment that makes a difference using Hollywood's money.
And I'm Jim Clementi. I'm a former New York City prosecutor, retired FBI profiler, and expert witness in the area of child sex crimes and child abduction homicides.
I'm Ryan Schuling, a radio reporter who covered the Nassar case dating back to the initial testimony of Kyle Stevens, who was then Jane Doe, in courtrooms ranging from Mason, also here in Lansing, sentencing with Judge Aquilina, and Allie's a colleague of mine. We covered the case together in large regard.
Great, so let's just get started on some of the basics of this. Let's talk about what is a nice guy or gal acquaintance offender. And then Jim, maybe in the same context, you'd like to address your what you think about the word predator and why guy-girl acquaintance to you is it more of an important word to use?
Sure. So the term nice guy or nice gal, acquaintance offender, refers to somebody that is known to the victim. Vast majority, over 90% of victims are victimized sexually by somebody they know, love, and trust. And nice guy or gal, acquaintance offenders, refers to the fact that they are known. Stranger danger is a real and present danger, but it's only a danger to somewhere about 160 to 200 victims a year in the United States, whereas child sexual victimization happens to generally about 3 million or more children every year in the United States. So you can see the relative difference in the danger. Vast majority of kids are going to be victimized by somebody they know, love, and trust. The reason why I don't like to use the term predator, which is the most common moniker that people use to describe child sex offenders or sex offenders in general, is the fact that they hide behind nice exteriors. They can be good people. They can be successful professionals. In fact, many of them are pillars of the community. They rise to the level of excellence because they are so committed to their connection with children. And people see that as a wonderful thing. They're volunteers, they're great teachers, they're great coaches, they're great parents, they're great police officers or FBI agents. But they could all still have a sexual attraction to children. And that is what we need to look at, not their exterior. And by calling them predators, what we're doing is teaching children to look out for monsters, lions and tigers and bears, oh my, not the nice person that we know and love and trust that our parents hand us over to. And we need to change that because it is setting these kids up for victimization, and then they have no place to turn once they get victimized because they're being victimized by somebody that mommy and daddy turned them over to or by mommy and daddy. And that's an important thing. Kids have to know where the real danger lies.
I don't know if anyone else wants to elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, I just completely agree with Jim, although I do use the word predator, and I get yelled at by Jim a lot for it, which might be why I do it. It might be why I do it. But, you know, when I give presentations to schools and communities and other professionals, youth serving organizations, I use a series of photographs and ask them to commit to answering my question, does this person look like a predator? And I put photographs up. And just between us, don't tell anybody, they're all predators, but most of them don't look like what we think of as a predator. You know, one is the album cover from Jethro Tull's Aqualung, who looks like a guy who sits on a park bench and eyes little girls with bad intent. But the rest are actors like Mark Salling. Sorry, I don't know what's happening here. Like Mark Salling from Glee, the actor who committed suicide last year after being prosecuted for possessing child pornography. Or soap star Corey Sly, who was just a few months ago convicted in my home state of Georgia for his sexual assault of an 8-year-old relative that took place over a period of time. Or any number of other offenders. I have pictures of Big Brother, Big Sister volunteers. And then I have lots of pictures of female teachers. Because ultimately, there's a bias in our society that says two things that are both wrong. First, if your chaperone for your event is a woman, your kids are safe. Or two, if the chaperone or the camp counselor is another teenager or a juvenile, your kids are safe. And neither of those things are necessarily true. And I should just say, they're probably true statistically, but they're not necessarily true. And I think those are some of the myths that Jim and I try to bust whenever we talk about this topic.
I was going to say also, you know, in my case, I was sexually abused by Larry Nassar in 2004. And with, you know, many other offenders, he was someone that I knew and I trusted and that my family knew and trusted. So I went to the appointment alone with him when I was sexually abused because my parents felt like, you know, he's this prominent physician, we trust him, and so they didn't sense any danger in that aspect. And so many of the other victims, you know, it was the same situation with them where their parents entrusted them to this person because he was a prominent physician. And he used that to sexually abuse children.
Who are the most dangerous types of offenders?
Well, Jim can answer that, but briefly, I have to say I also have in my presentation slides a comparison between two female teachers that were both prosecuted for the same thing, Rachel Holt and Pamela Rogers. And Rachel Holt is a, at best, average-looking woman. Pamela Rogers is a, you have to say, beautiful blonde bombshell. And they were both prosecuted for exactly the same conduct with male students. Rachel Holt went to prison for 10 years. Pamela Rogers got probation. And when Pamela Rogers got out, went on probation, she was prohibited from contacting boys under the age of 18. And she proceeded to offend against a girl under the age of 18. So who's more dangerous in that situation? I would argue it's Pamela Rogers, who looks like nobody that would hurt a child.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that child abduction, 50% of the child abductions for the long-term non-familial child abductions are motivated by sexual motives. And that's about 160 to 200 a year, whereas, as I said, the incidence of child sexual victimization in the country, those that use child advocacy centers that report it are about 300,000 a year. And that's somewhere less than around 10% of the actual victimization that occurs every year. It takes 20 to 30 years for the average person to come forward. So we won't know everybody that was actually victimized by Larry Nassar till 20 or 30 years from now, likely. But the fact is that offenders who snatch and grab a kid, who abduct a child, they set off every alarm in the community, and everybody, law enforcement and the community, all goes out and looks for this child. Somebody who grooms a child into compliant victimization can repeat that offense over and over and over again. The most prolific offenders are those offenders, those male offenders who offend against adolescent male victims. They, instead of having 2 or 3 victims a year, or in their entire career, they may have 200 or 300. And that's a very common thing. So they are the most prolific offenders, but by far the most insidious and I say dangerous offenders are those that we hand our kids over to and our young adults to because we know and love and trust them. And it's very unfortunate because then we cut off the ability for our children to come and talk to us about it because they know the relationship. And as I said before, the parents, may even be the offenders.
Speaking of grooming, can you describe the grooming process for both the victim and perhaps parents or teachers or people who are around children or other individuals who may also get groomed? as well?
Sure. Do you want to start? No.
So grooming is a constellation of behaviors. It's not just one thing, and it is a series of things, any one of which may very well be innocent. Things like giving children privileges, allowing them to do the forbidden with masturbation or sex or pornography, alcohol or cigarettes, giving them special treatment that other children don't have, singling them out for attention. It's a bunch of things that taken together show a pattern. But this pattern can, like I said, can make us think that this is just a person who absolutely adores kids. It's someone who's the teacher of the year. It's the person who's always the first or the last to volunteer for everything. They volunteer to spend more time with your kids than you would want to spend with your kids. And so it's a bunch of behaviors that you have to understand and look out for that are all designed for one purpose, and that's to break down the role boundaries between adults and children that allow that kind of relationship then to be fostered so that the child either doesn't understand what's happening to them or thinks it's okay because their parents told them that this is the person they need to see or need to spend time with in order to be successful in music or academics or athletics. So it's a pattern of behavior.
So I say that what grooming is that pattern of behavior that gives an offender access, authority, and control over a victim or victims. And it's typically accomplished by giving affection, attention, or assets. Things the child needs. It could be the basic needs that the child has, food, shelter, clothing, or it could be they shower them with extra gifts, things they don't need, things that make them, as Francie said, feel special. But why does this work? Well, let's look at how it works with adults. If there's somebody that you're attracted to, what do? You pay attention to that person. You show affection to that person. You give them a ring, you can have sex with them for the rest of your life, or not at all. But the fact is that you know it works with adults. Why wouldn't it work when an adult is manipulating a child with it? Of course it works. And what it does is it creates this ambivalence on the part of the child, on the part of the victims, because they love this person. They looked up to this person. They feel like they're special because of how this person is treating them. They have a need for nurturing, and these offenders take advantage of that and turn that into a sexual thing, and they help rationalize that behavior in their own minds by saying, well, the child wanted it. Well, this behavior, when you have sexual behavior between an adult and a child, it's not necessarily painful or horrible. It could be nice, and it could be pleasurable. And that adds to the guilt down the road for the child. And that adds to why there's this conspiracy of silence around it. Because a child who is being victimized, when they're groomed, they feel like they're beholden to this person. There's a debt of gratitude to the person. And then on the other hand, they may be feeling these really weird or negative or yucky feelings about what's going on, or feeling great feelings about what's going on and be in love with the person. And then they get dumped because they age out. So there's all sorts of different psychological things that are going on throughout this process. However, it's not just aimed at the child. It's aimed at their parents and guardians, and it's aimed at the community as a whole. And I think Larry Nassar and I think Jerry Sandusky are perfect examples of this. That in their professions, they were highly regarded. They were very successful. And both of them used their professions as an effort to groom not only the children or the young adults they were molesting, but the parents and guardians of those children and the community as a whole. They were held up in such high regard that the people around them, they actually helped. They treated kids and young adults, and they helped them. They helped them with their charities. They helped them in the community. And because of this positive influence they had on the community, people who were around them, the closest to them, are most susceptible to their grooming. And they believe in their hearts and minds, monster predators could not look and act like this person. Yeah, people out there think they were bad because they just see certain things, but they don't know the person. I know the person. I can't know somebody who's a sex offender. Well, I'm here to tell you that's absolutely wrong. That they can be wonderful people to others in the community. They can be wonderful people to their victims, but they can also have an ulterior motive. Now, there's preferential and situational offenders. Situational offenders are those that offend because of the situation. They're not actually sexually attracted to kids, but because kids are available and they're horny and they want to take advantage of them for sex, they do that. But preferential offenders, many people call them pedophiles, but pedophiles is only a small group of offenders who only are sexually attracted to prepubescent children. But preferential offenders are those that have a predisposed sexual attraction to children. They literally have the same sexual attraction that you and I have to age-appropriate adults. They have that for children. But it may be exclusive, it may be only children, or it may be that they could be sexually attracted to both children and adults at the same time. So they can maintain an adult, what looks like healthy relationship, but they may be doing it just to get access to their own kids or to get access to other kids.
Well, and one of the things that Jim said that's so significant there about the Jerry Sandusky case that you heard from the survivors is their real ambivalence about disclosing what they actually knew and recognized was sexual abuse. But these were largely underprivileged children who Sandusky was giving very high-level privilege to: access to the Penn State campus, trips to Penn State games, gear, bags full of shoes.
Meeting the players.
And these boys many of them have said that they really weighed whether they wanted to disclose what was happening to them because it meant they would no longer get these privileges. And that's the insidiousness of that kind of grooming.
And just to add to that, my observations of Kyle Stevens in the courtroom when she first came forward, and then also interviewing Larissa Boyce, two individuals who at a very young age recognized what was happening to them was wrong. And they sought the help that we encourage them to do, especially now, but they weren't believed. And as Jim was saying, the enablers are almost as dangerous in that situation as the actual perpetrators, because there's denial. I think a lot of us in our own minds, we don't want to conceive of, we don't want to believe that Larry Nassar could exist, that he could be this type of monster. We see Kathy Klages and the way that she interacted with Larissa Boyce did not allow her mind to conceive of the notion that maybe, just possibly, what this young girl was telling her was true. And Kyle Stevens, Jim said this too, her own parents not only didn't believe her, but sat in a session with Dr. Gary Stolick of Michigan State University and Larry Nassar himself and allowed themselves to be charmed and groomed by Larry Nassar to the point where Kyle Stevens was told by her parents to apologize to Larry Nassar and to babysit for Larry Nassar's own children. So then you wonder, why do these young people not come forward even when they know it's wrong, even when they know something is not right about what's happening to them? Look what happened to Kyle Stevens. Look what happened to Larissa Boyce when they did come forward, and that was a failure of the adults in the room, the parents that are responsible for at least listening to these young children and believing them and defaulting to the sense of, we're going to believe this young person, because why else would they come forward? It would be so difficult if you think about this in your mind. If you can relate back to when you were 9 or 10 years old, to come forward, to have them actually come forward and say these things. The fact that the default position of the adults in charge was to dismiss it and to believe Larry Nassar instead, I think is the crux of the problem.
Yeah, and I think part of that problem, and the thing that we're here to prevent today, is that they were not educated. We are here to educate the public, people in this room, the people in this community, and the people in this world, that this is a clear and present problem in every community. 1 in 4 children will be sexually victimized by the time they're 18. That's the stats today. Are we going to let that continue, or are we going to stop it? The best way to stop it is to educate ourselves and educate our children. For some reason, we believe that keeping children naive and protected against sex is going to help prevent them from being victimized. In fact, it does the opposite. It sets them up for victimization. Every preferential offender out there would love to have the opportunity to teach their child about sex. They would love to have the opportunity to engage in sexual activity with them. They would love to have the opportunity to keep secrets like this from their parents. Unless your child knows that this is a possibility, then how can they ever get over the fact that you turned them over to this offender? How can they ever get over the fact that this offender is mommy or daddy or cousin Billy or Uncle Joe or Aunt Sally or our teacher or our coach or our community leader or our religious leader? How can they get over that fact if they don't know that you know that it's okay for them to come forward and talk about this? There's a million little things that we do, little nonverbals that tells kids don't talk to us about sex. If it comes on the TV, we change the channel. If it's on the radio, if we're talking about it, we do it quietly away from them. That teaches them that sex is not a topic that we can talk about, that children can talk about with us. We need to start a dialogue with them at a very early age. Why not while they're still in the womb? See, the thing is, the later you wait to talk to kids about sex, the greater a hurdle you have to get over to do so. It's your insecurity about it that transmits to them. They know you're uncomfortable talking to them about it, and therefore they won't talk to you about it. We think by keeping them ignorant of sex and sexual victimization, we're protecting them. But what do we do when we live on a busy street? We know it's a danger, so what do? We tell the children from a very early age, that's dangerous. Those cars could hurt or kill you. So go to the corner, hold hands with mommy and daddy. We'll walk across with you. We'll look both ways, and we'll do it with you until we know you can do it alone. But for some reason, we're so ashamed of sex that we don't want to talk to children about it. We think it'll destroy their lives. In fact, it will help protect them because they'll know what it is and they'll be willing and able to talk to us about it. And that's what we need them to do because we can't be with them 24 hours a day. And we certainly do have to trust people in our communities. But you should seriously scrutinize anybody who wants to spend alone time with your child. I don't care who it is. If it's the Pope, do it. If it's the chief of police, if it's the FBI agent, if it's anybody, scrutinize it. Why? Ask yourself why. Why is it necessary that anybody spends alone time with your child? Why is this person always volunteering to pick up your child and bring them there? Yes, it's convenient when you have other kids and a lot of other things going on, but is it safe for your child? Is it safe to let them do overnights with this person or sleepovers at that house? Question it.
Brian, did you want to say something?
Oh, I mean, just when we were talking about in terms of the grooming process, just as an example, Larry was started grooming me. At my first visit with him, he just seemed really engaged in my care, and I thought, wow, this Olympic doctor is taking such an interest in me, and it made me feel, special in that regard. And at the end of the appointment, he gave me a hug, which I thought was odd at the time, but honestly didn't think anything of it. But looking back, I realized that just like other offenders, he was, gradually crossing those physical boundaries. And then it was at the next appointment, I came alone because my dad was very sick and, was dying from cancer at the time. He knew that I was very vulnerable, and that I would be an easy target. And so he used that vulnerability. And, my trust in him, I, kind of went along with it. But not only did he groom me, but he groomed my family and the police after I reported. After I reported to the police, he convinced my parents that I had misunderstood the treatment and, that he was really invested in me and actually continued to try to see me even after I made a police report against him. I have phone records from him and my mom where my mom was calling to cancel the appointments and he was trying to convince her to have me come in and just the legitimacy of the treatments and how they were going to help me. So, just in everyone in that scenario, even the police officer, he managed to manipulate.
This is a question from the audience, which I think would be a good question to ask now. When you talk about people that are sexually attracted to children a percentage of the time, what are the other reasons that people may assault? Is there power, control, narcissism? What are some of those characteristics to look for?
Yeah, on the spectrum of offenders, there's preferential, those have the definitive sexual attraction to children, and situational, those that don't but who do otherwise offend. They can offend on the situational side for power, control, to manipulate, to just actually take advantage. There's a number of different reasons. But many of the offenders who are sort of in the middle have some attraction to kids and some non-attraction to kids, but they have to overcome that. And Dr. Sullivan from Ireland says that it's sort of like, you know, a brick wall. Offending, you have to leap over the brick wall the first time. And every time you leap over that wall to offend, you kind of knock some of the bricks off. And it becomes a shorter and shorter and shorter wall. And so eventually you have rationalized your way, you know, made up your own excuses for why this is not wrong, and eventually it's not even a wall to step over. And so over time, it could become easier and easier and easier for these people to offend, and especially somebody like Nasser, who was bold enough to walk into the police department with a PowerPoint presentation to convince these people that what he was doing was legitimate treatment. To have that under his belt, and just like Sandusky, who was investigated, and by the district attorney's office, by the Department of Child Welfare, by the Department of Family Welfare, by the local police department at the campus, investigated by all of them, and, quote, cleared by the psychologist who interviewed him because he said that he was not sexually attracted to children, that he was just trying to help children, and he was so hurt and offended that he could possibly have done something that hurt this child. And he was so convincing that they let him walk back and do exactly the same thing over and over and over again. These offenders are very skilled at it. And I believe Sandusky, I wrote it in my report, he started probably in the late 50s, early 60s, when he was in late adolescence or his early 20s. He probably started offending then, and he got better and better and better and bolder and bolder and bolder at it. And by the time you see some people, one of the first guys I arrested in New York City when I was an FBI agent there was a guy who was a big brother. And he was, I believe, an ABC news guy, and he had all sorts of power and authority. And his little brother had complained and said he didn't want to go back to this guy. And he went and threatened a lawsuit against Catholic Big Brothers if they didn't put him back with the child, and so they did. And when he eventually was arrested for sexually victimizing that boy and many others, they destroyed the records. The records disappeared. That is a major problem. When you talk about collusion or, I can't remember what the, complicity, that is complicity. But we have to be very careful with how we use these terms. There are people who literally cannot believe that this person they know is an offender. Literally. Absolutely. I don't believe the parents brought their child back to apologize because they believed it, but they still wanted their child to be victimized. They didn't believe it. They need to be educated. Then there's people who are negligent. When you start getting enough people saying these things are happening, or even one very detailed complaint, you have a responsibility not to absolutely believe everything a child says or any victim says, but to absolutely not disbelieve them. Not just because they're a child or a woman or a boy or a man. You don't disbelieve anybody because of a class they fall in. You need to listen to them and vet what they say and then move forward. But then beyond that, beyond the negligence of not learning, so you can't validly verify the allegations, there is people like, I can't remember his name, the other administrator at Michigan State.
Sample?
Yes, who was later arrested for doing very similar things. Obviously, there are people who actually are complicit. There have been a number of schools in New York City, for example, where that has happened, where there's a number of teachers or administrators over the years that did not discourage, they actually encouraged this kind of behavior. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church is a very big organization, but every religious organization in this country and in this world also has similar issues because they are target-rich environments. They give people access, authority, and control over children. But what the Catholic Church was doing was moving people around, playing checkers and chess with children's lives. And that's a big problem. So when it gets to complicity, the law definitely has to step in. But we have to first educate people so that everybody in those positions knows the information, and then they can become responsible for their actions after that.
How do you work towards gaining that, getting more people to to comply and to do different things like report sexual abuse when you have big institutions that win, that get medals, and like we saw with Nassar and like we saw with Sandusky. When there's winning, when there's success, how do you get people to do the right thing?
Well, I've heard that in Michigan State, they ended up settling for $500 million. I'm sure Penn State, they spent, I think, $60 million or something like that. I don't know what the actual numbers are. But when schools and institutions have to pay that kind of money, they start to realize this is a major thing. Obviously, you know, their legal teams and their insurance teams all are very concerned about that kind of thing. But that shouldn't be the motivation. The fact is that institutions are made up of individuals. And those individuals have individual responsibilities. Even if they're not mandated reporters, they have a responsibility to the children that they serve and the young adults that they serve, and they should take that on. The way to encourage that is by being an example yourself, by sharing what you're learning today, by talking to people about it, by making sure that it's not a topic that people just say, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I do it with Criminal Minds. I've written 3 episodes about my case, the fact that I was sexually victimized as a kid. And I got that out to a total of 180 million people around the world. 180 million people know my story now, because I was able to use the media to get that word out. And I try, as Francie said, what we try to do is talk about learning opportunities because of these cases. We use the media now to get that information out. And I think everybody in this room cares about it enough to do this, and you should share that with your friends. And if your friends say, oh, don't tweet about that, don't put that on Facebook, then get right in their face and say, this is important. And tell them to talk to me, or Francie. She's even stronger than me. So I think it's something that we have to start at an individual level. We all vote. We all go to pick what university our kids go to and so forth. And they're going to feel it in the pocketbook. But I think we should lead by example.
Well, and so I do a lot of training at schools. I was in Minneapolis, or just outside of Minneapolis, last week at Shattuck St. Mary's, which is a boarding school. And they, to their credit, wanted me to come in and talk not just to faculty and staff in the community, but to the kids. And they have kids there between 6th and 12th grades. And again, to the school's credit, this is, I think, the third or fourth year I've been there. They have never said one word to me about what I can or cannot say, what language I can or cannot use to those children. And I am a very blunt speaker. I've been a sex crimes prosecutor my whole life. So all the sex terms do not frighten me. I will use them in front of anybody. My dad used to come watch me try cases, and so I had to use the word like vagina in front of my father, which was weird the first time I did it. But you have to be able to say those terms. You have to be able to talk about masturbation. And
if you can't say it, how are these children going to say it to you?
That's exactly right, and that's what I do. And the very first time I went to the school, the kids gave feedback to the teachers and professors afterward, and they said, wow, she talked to us like no one else in our lives has ever talked to us. Because 1, I talked very plainly about sex. But number 2, I explained to them that there are people out there who might want to try to victimize them. And I talked about what that would look like and how they could fight against it and why it's bad and why you can't have a relationship with a teacher and the effects later in life and being the hero and rescuing their friends, even if their friends don't understand that they need rescuing. So, you know, I say it all the time and I sound like a broken record, but training, but especially training kids. I like to say that kids are their own first best line of defense against sexual exploitation. If they understand what's happening to them when they're being groomed, they will hopefully report it. If they understand when they're being touched in a way that makes them uncomfortable and might be sexual, they'll report it. And so if we're not teaching the kids, we're failing miserably.
What should you be teaching the kids? How blunt should you be? Should you decide what to say and when to say it based on age?
Yes, it should be age appropriate, definitely. And you know, the terms you use, what we do and what we train child advocacy centers, I'm sorry I have trouble with that word, child interview specialists to do is is ask the child what terms they use for their different body parts and use those terms with them, because we don't want to superimpose terms on them. But clinical terms, I think, can be used at a very young age. It's not a bad word if you're talking to your mother or father about your own body, parts of your own body, and what people might or might not do to those parts of your body. And I think that it's our hang-ups about that creates a conspiracy of silence that allows these offenders to slip in, silently offend, and know that our children aren't going to talk about it. And it's really, really bad that that's the case. If we're open about it, then that goes away. But Chief, I want to ask you, I understand you have a program of education and to try to help combat this problem. Can you tell us about it?
Well, we've been working with Brianne since, all this case came to light, and there's actually been both school districts in the community have been put together, and through Brianne's kind of led the charge and brought some informational and bringing some training to the community so that there is that awareness, so that people have an understanding as to what the signs are, what the symptoms are, so that if a child brings something forward or says something or behaves in a specific way, that we understand that could be an indicator, and sometimes it is an indicator, sometimes it's not, but it could be an indicator of something going wrong, and to take the appropriate steps and what those steps and resources are for somebody.
Well, and Allie, I told the sixth graders last week, I told sixth graders that one of the signs of grooming would be that someone, an adult, would be asking them about sex, asking them about what kind of sex they might have had, asking them about their habits with respect to masturbation, talking to them about sex, showing them pornography. I used all of those terms with sixth graders, and there was not a single giggle or look of discomfort in the auditorium. And I think that was because I don't seem uncomfortable when I talk about it. And that's very difficult, I think, for parents, because like Jim said, we seem to have these hang-ups ourselves. I mean, can you even talk to your intimate partner about sex, right? I mean, we just have trouble with it for some reason. But that, I think, is leading down the road of children feeling like something sexual has happened to me. I can't talk to mom and dad about it, or mom or dad about it, because they don't let me talk about sex in the house. And so I think those discussions have to be had.
Well, and one other thing, Chief, if your officers want additional training, Francie and I could do that. We could do it over Skype if you want. And, we'll do training sessions. We train right now, we train NYPD and New York State Police together every year. And it's a comprehensive program and, a one-day program, and we go through all of this, in great detail, so that your officers will know how to interpret the behavioral information they get.
Well, that'd be something I'd be very interested in, and
Okay,
make sure
great.
you get that information to me before you take
Absolutely.
Great.
And I think that, the officers have already undergone some training, some trauma-based training programs, since all of this happened too.
Right. The whole way we've learned to investigate criminal sexual assault, child abuse, has really evolved over the years. We didn't have a great understanding of it. I remember going to the police academy several years ago, 20-some years ago, and how they trained us and taught us to investigate these cases. It's not just a facts approach and having an understanding. Every one of our officers just recently went through an 8-hour training on offender-focused, victim-centered investigations, and also those things that happen during a sexual assault, because trauma affects a body, and we've always thought about this in the understanding of, like, if an officer's involved in a shooting or somebody's involved in a violent encounter, that trauma, well, the understanding that sexual assault is a traumatic experience, and the way recollection and things come forward are different than those when you have something stolen from your house. And so
It's not a burglary.
Right, it's not a burglary, it's not a larceny, your car didn't get stolen, something horrible happened to you, and you can have disjointed memories, you can have things that come and go, and so sometimes stories, they don't come in a linear fashion, and in traditional law enforcement, that seems to be deceptive to police officers.
But I think you also have to remember that there's a spectrum of behavior that is child sexual victimization. And so on that one side of the spectrum, the traumatic side, that's all true. You can have the exact opposite on the non-traumatic side. You can have children who are literally feeling like they are being loved and taken care of, and that is sexual victimization. That's sexual assault or rape. And so their experience could be very different. And they may not want you to do anything to their parent or their teacher or their coach that they love. And they may recant if you take them away in handcuffs. So we also have to deal with that side of it. It's a very, very difficult, complicated problem. But if your officers know all the different possibilities along that spectrum, they're going to be better officers.
Speaking of law enforcement and prosecutors, obviously in the court of law, you need evidence to prove one way, side or another. How do you, if there is a situation where it's obvious, let's say in your opinion, that or from your knowledge, that this is a case where someone is being victimized, but there is no hard evidence to prove it, how do you suggest law enforcement agencies now and in the future work to bring those cases to get justice for those individuals?
Well, one thing that we did in the FBI, we made it a practice to try to look for multiple victims so that it is not pinned on the shoulders of one child.
And how do you do that?
Well, many people think, and unfortunately I think in the Sandusky case, they thought, well, we should do a complete investigation and then make it public. Well, I think you should make it public immediately, and you should make a call for people to come forward. Anybody who was in this teacher's class, anybody who was on this guy's team, anybody who spent time at this camp, anybody who was driven home back and forth in his convertible, whatever the circumstances of that case are, the police should say, this is a public service announcement. We would like anybody from this class to come in, or we're going to go and knock on the doors of anybody. Other people believe that you should never, quote, out a victim by knocking on their door. I disagree with that. I know, I was a victim and I was an investigator, and I know that I didn't even know that it was a crime. I didn't even know this could happen to a boy. I didn't know that there were other victims. So if somebody knocked on my door and said, you're not the only one. If somebody knocked on my door and said, look, we're here to help you. We know that there is an issue here and we'd like to help you with it. Then I wouldn't have been alone for those years, right? I wouldn't have been feeling horrible about myself for all those years. And so I believe that it's something we have a responsibility to do. And if you're able to, non-leading, ask and find out other victims, if you don't actually screw your case by saying, hey, did he do this to you? Because that would ruin him as a witness or her as a witness. If it's done properly, if children are interviewed by child interview specialists at child advocacy centers, that's a great thing. And if you then get multiple victims, most of the time, the offenders will plead guilty.
Well, and the other important thing, and I did this all the time as a state prosecutor, especially when you're talking about child sexual abuse inside the family. It was dad or stepdad. There were no corroborating victims, right? But there is potentially corroborating evidence. And that is critical, and I did it many times. I think even in adult rape cases, the general, in my experience, is there's corroborating DNA or physical injury in about 25% of the time. So 75% of even adult rape cases is basically her word against the offender. And in child sexual assault cases, it was even worse. There was DNA or other physical evidence, injuries, even less, because children often disclose accidentally and after some time has passed between the disclosure and the most recent event of abuse. So there isn't going to be DNA, there isn't going to be physical injury if there ever was any of those things. So what you have to do is you have to go to the child advocacy centers, get child interview specialists, and you have to get every last detail from that child that you can, and then make it your mission to corroborate it. And corroborating evidence can be something as simple as the child said that there's a blue bedspread on the bed. You go take that blue bedspread. So see, the child is telling the truth about having a blue bedspread. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the first day we got out for Christmas. Was the offender working at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the first day they got out for Christmas, or was he there? Was mom away on a shopping trip? Do you have receipts? There are all sorts of ways to corroborate. And one thing I always try to make clear to people, evidence doesn't just mean physical evidence. Evidence means testimonial evidence. So when a child is talking literally just talking about what's happened to them, that is evidence of a crime. So you have to try to go out and corroborate every little detail. And we also expect in accounts that we know are true based on research that children can talk about sensory perception. They can talk about how it affected them. How did they feel? How did it smell, taste, touch? This is a gross example, but I had a very young child once. She was 5 years old, and she was talking about having been coerced into touching the penis of her uncle. And she said that, well, he made me touch it. How did it feel? She described how it felt. It was sort of soft, but sort of hard. And, we know what that means. She doesn't know what that means. And then I said, did you ever taste it? Did you smell anything? And she described that white gummy stuff came out. Now, what 5-year-old is going to know that hasn't experienced that sexual assault? And so those are always to corroborate a true account that are outside of gathering physical evidence or even outside of having other victims. You can, I want to tell prosecutors out there, you can build a case based only on the child's statement when you can corroborate the details.
Right, and I think a perfect example of this is Dylan Farrow's statement. If you read Dylan Farrow's statement, she talks about spatial relationships, she talks about emotional things, she talks about very, very incredible details about the smell and the sounds and the touch and the relationship between them. Mm-hmm. All of those details are what we see in truthful accounts. And so it's something that we will look at with respect to the statement made by any victim, whether they're 5 years old, because that's generally the cutoff point. Under 5, it's difficult to get them sworn because they have to know, in order to testify in a court of law, they have to know the difference between truth and a lie, fantasy and reality and things like that. And sometimes children who are younger don't have that distinction yet. So 5 years and up, if you look at their statements, you can find those kinds of details generally in truthful statements.
That's right. And then, I'm sorry, the other thing is, so it's really sort of a two-part process in assessing the credibility of an account when you don't have things like DNA or physical signs of an assault, is also motive or bias. So in every case I ever brought that had around a teenage girl, any child over about the age of 10, was accused of having some kind of motive to lie about the offender. Your mom put you up to it, there's a divorce situation, you don't like your stepfather, you weren't allowed to go to the concert, so you've accused your dad of assaulting you. So you also have to determine whether there is that kind of motive or bias, and can you discount it? Because that is what building a case is ultimately. You build your case and you try to make sure there's no defense case to be built. And that's what you have to start doing from the very beginning of the case. And that's what I'm sure the chief in all his years as a police work, that's what you do, is you corroborate the account, whether you're picking up fingerprints, whether you're finding a gun or blood stains, or whether you're corroborating the details that the child has given you and making sure there are no holes for a defense attorney to drive a truck through.
And I did a talk recently with Angela Povolitis, the prosecutor on the Nassar case, and her biggest thing was, start by believing. So when a victim comes to you and reports something, you don't question it. You believe what they're saying. And that doesn't mean that you don't thoroughly investigate the case, but, if someone came to you and they were robbed, you wouldn't question them. You would just investigate it. And believe what they were saying. So the same goes for sexual assault victims.
Bree, I hate to disagree with you, but I'm going to.
Oh, that's right.
I really don't agree with that assessment. I have tremendous respect for the prosecutor, and that's how she handles her job, and that's how she handles her job. That wasn't how I handled my job. I did not believe. I didn't disbelieve, but I didn't believe either. I listened. I certainly didn't judge. But I was assessing. That's my job as a prosecutor, to seek justice, not convictions. And so it isn't my job as a prosecutor to believe the victim. It is my job to determine whether or not a crime was actually committed against that victim. And that involves looking critically, and that means sometimes skeptically, at the story that you're being given, because they are going to be challenged later in court. A good defense attorney is going to take them apart if there are holes in the story or if there are things they're saying that are easily disproved. And so, all due respect to you, Bree, I didn't handle things that way, and I think that we make a mistake and I don't want to get political, but I think we make a mistake when we have this, believe all victims. That is an absolute anathema to our justice system. Respect victims, don't disbelieve victims, agree completely. But I tell juries all the time, don't leave your common sense at the door to the courtroom. Think critically. You can't just believe simply because it's a child or simply because it's a woman or a man, or disbelieve simply because it's a man or a teacher or a coach. So the point is that when you're in the criminal justice system as a professional, you have to be able to think critically.
To pick up on what Francie said, and this is completely applicable, I completely agree with what you're saying in the equal distribution of justice. And there's a personal example I have with regard to what Bree was saying and Angie. I had conversations, I don't think she'll mind me making them public now, with Angie throughout a process that began. The alpha of the experience was a young woman who vehemently defended Larry Nassar initially about the treatment that she was given, and said so in a Facebook post response to me, and reached out to me. And then I decided at that time, doing a radio program, that I felt it was in the best interest of the public to hear both sides of this story. If there was somebody willing to come forward and vouch for the treatment that she received, she did so on my radio program, live, no holds barred, didn't say anything about being having any reservations about what she was going to tell me. And she went on for about 20 minutes, and call it gaslighting, call it Stockholm Syndrome, call it just being groomed, as we've talked about earlier, but again, fiercely advocating on behalf of Larry. Well, there was an evolution that took place after that, as a member of the media, in a similar fashion actually to Francie. I didn't want to sway her one way or the other. I wanted her to come to me with whatever information she had, opinions that she had. Ultimately, she wanted to speak in court during the sentencing phase for Larry Nassar, and so I had a conversation with Angie about that. And she wanted to make very sure, very clear, just as Francie was saying, that this witness, that this victim was properly vetted, that she went through this interview. And I even heard back from this young woman about her feeling a little bit on the defensive with Angie. Angie was very persistent in getting to the truth. Her name was Valerie Webb, and she stood forth and gave her testimony in court at that point. But I will say, to Bree's point, I think Angie kind of was in line with what Francie's saying. She listened, she vetted, she put Val through the ringer, and Valerie came out the other side, ultimately to the satisfaction, I believe, of Angie Povolitis, that she was a credible witness that could give testimony to that point, and she did so in court. But I could not agree more strongly with Francie, because I think there's a tendency now for overcorrection, that the pendulum swings the other way, where we just automatically believe an accuser, and you want to give the possibility that what this young woman or young man coming forward saying is true, but you can't condemn and convict based on that alone. There has a process.
Yeah, and I think the difference is that, Brianne, the prosecutor should make you feel like she believes you. She's listening to you. And that's an important thing from your perspective. Absolutely. They shouldn't the system shouldn't re-victimize victims. However, she has a responsibility as a prosecutor to make sure that she's only bringing forth cases in which she knows that the person is guilty of committing a crime. And it's a very complicated process.
Yeah.
And so that's what Francie's talking about. And when we say that your responsibility is to not disbelieve any person who comes forward, your responsibility is to listen. And listening is not just hearing. Listening is processing it and understanding it, and then corroborating it so that you can bring a case, or failing to corroborate it, not being able to bring a case, and hoping that if somebody comes forward to a prosecutor or a police department and says that this crime occurred, and yet they're not able to find corroborating evidence, hopefully they have the resources to continue to look, to set parameters, and to try to determine whether or not there's other ways of proving whether or not this person did this. For example, in the federal system, what we would do if there was a complaint like that we couldn't go forward on, we would find, maybe we'd insert an undercover online and find out if they're trading child pornography. We'd see if we can get into their computer system and see if they're collecting child pornography. Because if they are a preferential offender, that is one of the hallmark characteristics, that they also collect and trade and talk about child sex crimes and child images of child sex crimes. So there's sometimes other ways to get in the door and prosecute somebody, even if you can't prove that they're actually hands-on offenders.
Yeah, and I certainly don't mean to say that prosecutors should attack children or assault victims who come forward. I just mean question, right? There's a big difference between questioning an account and attacking the person giving it.
This is a question from the audience. What are some things that organizations can do to protect children in their care and protect people who work in organizations from false allegations? And then also, when is a safe situation, or does that even exist?
Okay, well, that's three very different questions. So let's talk about the first one. What they can do, the number one thing that any person or organization can do is get educated. There are plenty of materials out there. Go to nicmic.org, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.org, missingkids.org, same thing, and download Ken Lanning's monograph called Child Molesters, a Behavioral Analysis. Child Molesters, a Behavioral Analysis. And it's free, and you can get as many copies as you want, or you can download it and print it, or whatever you want to do. The fact is that it is a comprehensive look from a profiler's perspective of the behavior of the different types of child sex offenders. Educate yourself. That's number one. Number two is there's organizations like Safe for Athletes. Safe, the number 4, athletes.org. That was started by Catherine Starr, an Olympic athlete who was victimized by her coach over a number of years, and many other people were as well. And that organization, what Catherine did was research the law and organizational structure, and she has set out very plain language and documents and forms that any organization that's a youth-serving organization can use to educate everybody involved. The children, the coaches, the administrators, the parents, the families, the community, everybody can know what the rules are. And therefore, they can have a red line policy. If you violate this rule, one text from a coach to a child that doesn't go through the school or doesn't go through the parent, that person is fired. There's no appeal. If it's done, it's over. Because what we try to do is set the limits at the very base. Everything else is against the rules too, but all these baseline offenses, these insidious little things that they do, a phone call, oh, I'll help you, stay late, just don't tell anybody that you're gonna be working on homework together, or I'll help you do this, I'll help you do that, here's some candy, here's some, pornography, whatever it is. The guy who offended against me, what he did is the first day of school, he handed out a little survey to every person in class. What's your favorite ice cream? What's your favorite food? What's your favorite magazine? What's your favorite sport? And then he went through one by one and started giving gifts to the kids in the class, the boys in the class. And eventually, in one school, 13 kids in the class, he molested 11 of them. This is how effective this tool is, because grooming is something that works with adults and children alike, and when there's a huge power imbalance between an adult and a child, it works like a charm.
Is there more of a staunch difference? Like, people can be nice to children and give them gifts, but not sexually abuse them. Is there anything that individuals should be looking for that presents more of a staunch difference between the two?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that, as I said earlier, that constellation of behaviors, any individual flag, like giving a gift, may be perfectly innocent, but youth-serving organizations, schools must have policies that do not allow for actions that break down those role boundaries, because even if that teacher just wants to give that underprivileged child a new pair of shoes, and for an innocent purpose, the next teacher who gives that child a pair of shoes may be doing it for a nefarious purpose or a sexual purpose. So you just simply can't allow those policies, and that's why the Safe for Athletes and others have policies that you put into place that prevent that kind of relationship from forming and prevent that kind of access to children that is what leads to their victimization. And one quick last thing, Jim, about false allegations. If someone in your organization, or you yourself or someone in your family, are accused of some sexual crime that is false, let's say it is false, don't you hope you have police officers and prosecutors who are thinking critically about those accusations? So that's why educating about what happens, how these things come out, how grooming happens, what are the signs of being groomed, what are the signs of being abused. Understanding all of those things may help combat any potential false allegation, which I also do want to say is very rare. False allegations are very rare, but because they happen, we have to think critically about every allegation.
Yeah, and the studies show that the most common proven false allegations have come with children under the age of 5, most often girls, in custody disputes when a marriage is breaking up. And they are actually more susceptible to being manipulated by one parent or the other to say accusations. They don't really understand them. They're still very concrete thinkers, and they're still not really, they can't decide between fantasy and reality. There's all sorts of things that are going on in their brain, their developing brains, that make them susceptible to that. But clearly, after that age, it's extremely rare, and it is very extremely rare for a teenager to make a false allegation unless the situations are such that the child is, let's say, enamored with a teacher and makes a pass at the teacher and the teacher rebuffs it. And then, because they've been rebuffed, they may, knowing that they have the power to destroy somebody, they may try to hurt the teacher in that way. That has happened. And so the best thing to do is to have policies that are very clear about all this stuff, so that if a child is inappropriately propositioning a teacher or some other person, some other adult, that adult reports it immediately so that there's a record of it. Now, you have to make sure that everybody involved becomes aware of this. And that's why it's so much better if we're all talking about this stuff rather than this is the kind of stuff nobody wants to mention. Because then it becomes a huge issue to even talk about. And once we get past that, we can have much more open, frank discussions. And if things like that were to happen, for example, if somebody threatened, well, I'm going to say it happened even if it didn't, well, that's a really serious situation. That's a crime that they're talking about committing. And that needs to be reported as well. So children need to know the seriousness of this, as well as anybody who works in a youth serving organization.
How can our community learn from what has happened? Because it seems as though Sandusky happened before this, and they were happening, quite frankly, at the same time.
Yes.
What things are missing from, as far as education, policies in schools? What needs to be done from your knowledge?
Well, I'll tell you right now, we spoke this morning at Michigan State University, which I understand has 50,000 students, and there were 26 people in the audience. Where are the 54,974 other people? Where are they? They need to participate. They need to know that this is an important topic. This is something that almost destroyed their school. The reputation of their school certainly was damaged because of this case. Why are they not interested? Why didn't the school promote it? Why is it that people told us they heard about it on our podcast that we broadcast nationally? Why didn't they hear about it here? I don't know. I'm glad to see that the media is here covering this. There was some media there this morning. But we need better engagement on the part of the people that are actually involved in this.
It's ultimately, I think, too, an ugly topic. Nobody wants to talk about it. Well, Jim and I do. But nobody generally wants to talk about child sexual abuse. It's ugly. People do not, it's the only kind of crime you can think of that people do not want to discuss. Look at television. Crime TV is the number 1 or number 2 kind of television content all around the world. But what's it mostly about? Murder. Like, we're all perfectly, and I love that we do that kind of TV. So I'm happy people like it. But we're perfectly happy to talk about murder. You know, sometimes the more, I mean, we watch Criminal Minds, sometimes the more bizarre the way someone gets murdered, the more interesting it is to us. We don't feel the same kind of attachment to child sexual abuse. There are probably some good reasons for that, but we don't talk about it enough. Nobody wants to talk about it, and so I think they take whatever the easiest way out is. They put out a policy if you're a youth organization that says, don't molest kids. And they're like, yeah, we've got a policy protecting kids. Well, that's not how it works.
Right, but I just want to say that ABC, who is the studio that produces Criminal Minds, and CBS is the network that shows it, that airs it, they both have let me write a number of episodes about child sexual victimization, child abduction, child sexual homicides, and so forth. So they have let me put it out there in the world. And that's something that I had to fight for, really, because most of the time they don't want to put that on the air.
I want to follow up with the nexus of sports, in particular with sexual abuse. Allie, you talked about Jerry Sandusky. We're talking about Larry Nassar. Well, as the host of a sports talk radio program, what I can tell you, I had a lot of resistance to covering this. I had a lot of people questioning, why didn't I, quote unquote, stick to sports? Why am I bringing this ugly topic, as Francie puts it, into the public sphere? They look to me, they look to sports as an escape. It's a hobby, it's a diversion, it's a distraction from the everyday real life rigors. And maybe people escape by watching Criminal Minds or Law & Order SVU, but that's still kind of that fantastical notion of it's fiction. This is not fiction. This is here and now. This is front and center. And the thing that I experienced in covering this is exactly what Francie just said. People don't want to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about it. This topic found me. I didn't seek it out. But when Larry Nassar is in our community, when Larry Nassar abuses Bree in Meridian Township, when the police, for whatever reason, didn't handle it perhaps the way that they should have because they were snowed by Larry Nassar, when Dr. Stolick at Michigan State is snowed by Larry Nassar, when the very parents of these victims are snowed by Larry Nassar, when Kathy Klages is, that's enough evidence. Those are enough red flags to say people aren't educated. They don't know a Larry Nassar for what he is because they don't want to look. They don't want to believe it. They don't want to even conceive that somebody that they've believed in, that they have trusted, could be capable of such monstrous acts, because that's an indictment of themselves, in their ability to trust, to judge, to assess a situation. So when I brought this topic forward, I couldn't agree with Jim more. More people have to participate. They have to open their minds. They have to be willing to discuss these uncomfortable topics and do so in a public forum. And the one other thing I want to say that really gets me is I hear a Mitch Lyons, for instance, one of the members of the Board of Trustees, who turns to somebody like Bree or somebody like Larissa Boyce or somebody like Lindsay Lemke. You can go down the list and say, I have daughters. I don't have daughters. I don't need to have daughters to have a concern, to have empathy for victims. When I see Kyle Stevens on the stand going through the anguish, the terror, the horror of what she endured, too many people are, not my daughter, not my problem. That needs to end. These are all of our children. These are all of our daughters, our sisters, our nieces. You have to think of it in that context and not just be so closed off in your own world where it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect my kids, so therefore I'm not going to worry about it.
Well, the other thing about public health, if you look at it from a public health standpoint, is child sexual abuse can have extremely deleterious effects on those children as they go forward in life. Studies have shown us that there's increased depression, increased alcohol abuse, increased drug abuse, increased promiscuity, increased difficulty emotionally attaching. There are real societal consequences to child sexual abuse. It is a public health crisis, in my opinion, and has been for a long time, but we're not treating it like that. Instead, we're treating it like a dirty little secret that happens to somebody else's kid and we shove it under the rug.
I want to add to what you said. It's also our sons and our nephews and our cousins.
Yeah.
It's also happening to guys. There's an organization called malesurvivor.org, and it's an international organization of males who were sexually victimized. We have to also allow guys to talk about it. And when you talk about sports, even professional sports, I was on a panel with Shelton Kennedy, who was a very accomplished NHL hockey star, and what he had to overcome to come out and talk about the fact that his coach, this coach that was going to get him and did get him into NHL, that coach victimized him for years. And it's such a difficult thing. I had to have this talk with my nephew, who was also involved in hockey, and he was going away to play in I can't remember, American Hockey League, I think. It was a junior hockey league, I think it's called, American Hockey League. And I had to have this very difficult talk with him. And although he didn't get sexually victimized, he had a coach who literally one day when they have some kind of training where they do boxing, they're punching a heavy bag, and he's punching the heavy bag, and his coach said, "You're not doing it hard enough," and he kept yelling and screaming at him, and finally he punched him in the face. He punched my little 12-year-old nephew in the face. And my nephew immediately called his parents and reported it. And then he called me and said, "Uncle Jimmy, I never would have had the guts to tell on him because he's my ride to the NHL. I never would have told on him unless you had that talk with me." And this was a punch, not sexual victimization. So I think we have to infuse sports with this. Safe for Athletes is an incredibly important organization. And I think every athletic club, every club of any kind that has children, every club, school, organization, community should look at their sample policies because it is a great template and you can use it for anything. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever it is. And you can help make those places safer.
I do want to get to this one last question to the audience. We are running out of time, and I want to make sure that we're addressing some of the initiatives that you guys are working on, because you're working on them based on situations that you learned from. But before we get to that, this question is questions and concerns. Basically, and if I'm summarizing it correctly, what do you do, what advice do you have for an individual who is going to CPS and they're being stonewalled and nothing is being done despite reporting concerns, and you feel as though the process isn't happening the way it should due to lack of resources, due to lack of knowledge, or them, the CPS workers saying we need more evidence or something to that effect? What advice do you have for those individuals?
Okay, my understanding, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, CPS is for intrafamilial, things that are happening within the family or the quasi-family unit. Go to the police. If CPS is turning you away, this is a crime. Go to the police. And if the local police don't do anything, go to the state police. If the state police don't do anything, go to the FBI. Write to your senators, write to your mayor, write to your governor. These things are all tools that anybody can use, and we have to use them. The people that make the most noise, if it gets to enough people, something will be done. Now, I'm not saying that CPS may be right. There may not be a crime there. But CPS doesn't investigate crimes. They investigate allegations, and they're either founded or unfounded. The police investigate crimes, and those people should be investigating any child sex crime. It should not be kept just in an organization like CPS.
No, and CPS, I worked closely with them when I was a state prosecutor, and I've worked with some great people there, but they are generally underpaid, overworked, and overwhelmed, and there are far too many. There was just a case in Florida just a month or so ago where a little 2-year-old boy who'd been in foster care for about a year of his 2-year life was killed by his mother, in a remarkably similar case to the Kaylee Anthony case. And he was under CPS watch. They did not do everything that we looking back now think they should have and could have done. But also, don't ignore your district. I think, do you have district attorney or is a state's attorney here? Who prosecutes your felonies here?
Attorney General.
Attorney General?
Prosecuting attorney's office of the county, by each
okay.
county.
Every state calls it something different, but don't ignore your prosecutor's offices. If you're not getting satisfaction from the police, check your prosecutor's offices. They always have investigators, and if they don't investigate the crime themselves, they may refer it out to the police department, which is potentially going to get more attention than what you could get yourself.
And any time that you don't feel that you're getting your issue addressed, put it on paper, make a record, because then somebody has to actually look at it, and it creates a trail. And, you know, the vast majority of law enforcement officers, and let me tell you, there's 500,000 law enforcement officers in the United States alone at the different local, state, and federal levels. The vast majority of them would jump at the chance of helping people. There are some who are not very well equipped because they're not educated, they don't have the training, or they don't have the resources. So sometimes it helps them if you go one step higher, because maybe the one step higher could then fund the training and the resources that they need. But I would work with the law enforcement officers, and I would also document. I would write letters. I would make sure that they are aware of every detail that you have, and keep it going up the chain.
And I want to speak a little bit to the referral from the protective services. If Child Protective Services receives a referral, we get it, but how fast we get it. If you have a concern about a child, report it to the police department, and then we can look at it. We'll forward it to the protective services for their piece, but if you go to protective services and don't involve law enforcement initially, there can be a delay in time, and that delay can cause issues with either the criminal case or even increased victimization. So if you have a concern about a child's safety, the police department's where you go. And if it's a CPS non-law enforcement issue, we refer up to them, but their referral to us sometimes can be delayed, and that's important to understand.
Yeah, and it's a time-sensitive issue when we're talking about building a case. Forensics go away, and circumstances can change. And it's very important that children get justice right from the start. If they are lucky enough to be able to come forward as a child, then this should be addressed as a crime immediately. I don't like any of these, whether it's the Catholic Church doing it, or a school district doing it, or some other organization doing it, any of these, quote, internal organizational investigations that will then decide whether they go to the police. If a crime is reported to you, the police should investigate it. If they decide that it doesn't rise to the level of a crime and want you to do an institutional investigation, that's fine. But it shouldn't be the other way around.
So, Jim, it's interesting you say that, because with the Nassar, the whole thing that has happened, there have been internal investigations, and there have been people calling for outside external investigations, and we hear crickets, nothing happens. What do you suggest people do? We can talk all day about doing the right thing and being educated and people stepping in and following proper protocols. But if it's not happening, despite people screaming and speaking out about it, what do we do?
Well, stop giving your money to the university. Stop sending your kids. I mean, if you don't like what's happening, you can talk with your money. You should always talk with your votes, but you have choices to make. Where do your kids go to school? Who do you give money to? What community do you live in? All of these things are a matter of choice, and I think it's also a matter of agitating. The squeaky wheel, just ask Jim, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Mm-hmm. I think also, protest is something you can do, and write letters and use social media and get people on the bandwagon. Document it. There are petitions that get signed by 150,000 people. Well, if there are 50,000 students there, I believe some of them are probably pissed off at how this was handled. And I think they should organize that way. I'm glad that we're here today. I'm glad that we have the opportunity to educate people here, and we'd like to continue doing that. And there are many more like us out there who are ready, willing, and able to do that. And you should look to organizations like Stop It Now, which has had a policy for many years now, stopitnow.org. If you know somebody who is thinking about offending, if somebody has the inclination or the feelings or the desires and wants to get help to not offend, stopitnow.org can help you do that. And they have education for family members and children alike so that people can learn about this. And they also provide anonymous information for people who may be at risk of offending. And I think that we should at least embrace the fact that some child sex offenders, some sex offenders, can be treated away from offending. Others may not be able to, and certainly all of that has to do with what they want to do. If they truly want to get help, they can get help to stop offending.
When it comes to social media, how do you suggest people should be looking out for, talking to their children? Social media is changing every day as far as apps go, internet sites, people who will use the internet to find victims and to groom. What should people look for when it comes to that?
Well, unfortunately, what it means is the parents and guardians have to stay on top of new technology. If they can't do it, then somebody else will. Somebody else will, unfortunately, get access to their kids. Child sexual victimization used to be a home and community problem. Now it's a global problem. Now anybody around the world who wants to get access to your child for sex can, because almost every child has a phone, or some device that gives them access to the internet. And it's very unfortunate. But that tool that expanded our minds and expanded our reach also did the same for offenders. And it gives them the anonymity that actually helps them offend and reoffend. So it's a responsibility on the part of parents to not give their child something that they don't themselves understand. And I'm sure that happens every day. I don't completely understand what my phone can do. And, I use it a lot. So I know my father doesn't understand at all what his phone can do. We have to be more savvy. We have to take classes. We have to learn. And we have to be able to, and we have to demand that apps and big companies like Google and Facebook and Yahoo, they all should provide mechanisms for parents to protect their children from this and more transparency.
And I tell parents all the time that if on a regular, random basis, you're not looking at your child's devices, you are insane. If you think your child is not engaging in risky behavior, the statistics suggest that 30 to 40% of children, by the way, admit to sending and receiving sexts, illicit sexual images of children under the age of 18. So your children are doing it. They're certainly at risk for that and for predation. See, Jim, I use predation instead of predator, so I'm hoping to fool you into not thinking I said the word predator. But they're at risk for predation from those people online. Your children should not be, for example. I asked the kids in the audience, how many of you play games? Almost every child, 6 through 12, raise their hand, they play online games. How many of you play online with people you don't know? 3/4 of them raise their hand. How many of you play online with adults you don't know? That same 3/4 hand stayed right up. They're talking to adults, they've got the headset on, they're playing Fortnite or whatever their game is, and they're talking to grown-ups. And how careful do you think the 12-year-old boy playing the game is about giving out information about himself to the strangers that he's talking to? Not careful at all. So we could go on and on about online, protecting kids online, because it's a whole other topic, but you have to understand your child's devices, you have to check your child's devices, and you have got to monitor what they're doing online with social media and with gaming.
So we've been talking a lot about what are some things people can do. As it relates to Brianne and the Meridian Township Police Department, they're actually taking a lesson learned and they're implementing new policies and procedures and putting forth an initiative to help make sure that something like what happened never happens again. So if you guys just want to briefly talk about some of the things that you're doing, and Chief, if you want to also, for other law enforcement officials that may be watching this, give them some advice as to how they can look back and change their policies.
I'll kind of talk briefly about our initiatives, and then you can also talk about what you have done for the police department. So I've been working with Meridian Township on some prevention efforts. So our initiatives include a brochure, which we've dispersed to the community, and we have available today as well. So that just kind of gives a few bullet points on how to recognize these signs of abuse, how to talk to your kids about this difficult issue, because as we discussed today, that's really important and it's not happening enough. So we need to start talking to kids and talking to them early, using correct terminology for body parts so that they understand this. And then also just how to report abuse if you suspect it, and resources for survivors and families. In addition to that, we have Stewards of Children training by Darkness to Light, and that is a 2-hour training for adults on how to recognize and respond appropriately to child sexual abuse. So we have 2 sessions, and the first one is full and the second one is almost full. And so that's a really great way for the community to engage in this issue and to be educated on it. And then lastly, we also have some school-wide interventions. I've been working with Okemos and Hazlitt Public Schools on that.
And so kind of as it affected our agency, one of the things that we really saw that was necessary was to bring forth this training. We sent all of our folks through full days worth of training in how to do and it really is that believe piece. And it's not really, Francis, it's not the prosecution piece or the whether you're going to bring charges. It's when they come to the desk or when you go to their house and you're getting that initial report, is to don't dismiss, don't it is to believe what the child is saying. We're still going to do a complete and full investigation, but we're going to center our investigation on the victim, the survivor, and then focus on the alleged perpetrator. So we're going to focus our investigative resources to either proving or disproving something happened, while keeping that victim-centered approach. And because the handling of sexual assault victims with the trauma, a lot of times that comes with it, and this is not just children, this is across the entire gamut. Being so close to a university, we deal with a lot of university offenses that involve students, and it's making sure that our officers have an understanding of how to do that effectively and come with those best results, so that if we do have an offender, we can bring charges in successful prosecution, which is our goal to prevent these things. The other thing that we did is we went back through 17 and a half years of criminal sexual assault complaints, and literally went through each individual report and made sure that all things were properly addressed. One of the things that I kind of picked up that Francie said was, if the police don't think that it warrants charges and kicks it back for an internal investigation, kind of with Bree's case, it's one of those things that happened. Our detective did an investigation and was fooled, believed what the materials that were presented by Dr. Nasser, and didn't believe that there was probable cause to issue a warrant. Now, did they bring that to a prosecutor to let them review? No, that was another thing that we've done, and that's one of those things we've changed now, is that we're going to get that outside review from a prosecuting attorney's office to make sure that, hey, case is in full, what do? You send it back, say, I need this, this, and this, and the prosecutor lets us know what other information they would like to see before they make a informed decision on whether to bring charges against somebody. So every investigation we're doing now involves prosecutor review, and especially in criminal sexual assault cases. So those are the things that we've kind of put in place, continuing ongoing training. That's kind of one of the things Jim, kind of brought it up, and I'm like, well, let's see what you got, Jim. We'll listen to you. Sure. And just making sure that we reach out to the community and we actually listen to what we're hearing. Working with Bree's been great. There's been a lot of successes. It was amazing with very little publicity how fast the classes started to fill up the darkness to light, and that's that kind of that hope piece for me is that people are going to become educated, they're going to become aware of this problem, and be equipped to address the situation effectively.
How are we doing on time? Okay. Well, okay, so how can people ask you guys questions if they want, since we're running out of time? Is there any information that they can get from you? And before you answer, I just want to let everyone know that this forum will be available on hometv.net, and it will also be replayed on Home TV Comcast Channel 21. So for those of you listening or those of you here, you can definitely refer back to that if you'd like to. Okay, how can people get in touch with you guys afterwards?
Francie and I have a podcast called Best Case, Worst Case, and we have a Facebook page, and you can certainly reach out to us on that Facebook page. And we try to address the questions that come up either in the podcast or by responding back to whoever wrote them.
So we actually do have a Facebook page for this. It's at Meridian SAP. And that just gives more resources to adults in the community on how to talk to your kids about this subject. And feel free to send us any messages on there as well.
Could you say that again? At Meridian?
At Meridian SAP.
There are also some individuals from EVE in the back for anyone who would like to talk with them. Speaking of individuals who help people who have been abused. So I just wanted to let people know that if you want any more information on that, there is someone in the back as well. Let's give our panel a round of applause. Thank you.
And I want to thank Bree. Thank you so much for being so strong and for thriving. That's a great thing.
Thank you. Thank you.